U.S. Senators urge Biden to avoid India sanctions over Russian deal. 2 U.S. Senators have urged President Joe Biden to waive sanctions against India over its purchase of Russia's S-400 air defense system, saying such a punitive measure would endanger growing cooperation. India signed a $5.5 billion deal with Russia in 2018 for 5 of the surface-to-air missile systems for defense against longtime adversary Pakistan and China, with which it is locked in a standoff on their disputed border. But the proposed transfer has caused friction with the United States, which passed a law in 2017 under which any country engaged with Russia's defense and intelligence sectors could face sanctions. Republican Senator John Cornyn and Democrat Senator Mark Warner wrote a letter to Biden Tuesday calling for a waiver on the grounds of national security and broader cooperation. "We believe there is a national security imperative to waiving sanctions," the senators said in their letter, which they issued in a press release. They said they were concerned the transfer of the Russian systems would trigger sanctions against India under the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which was enacted to hold Russia accountable for interfering in U.S. elections, cyber hacking, and bullying Ukraine. India has made a down payment on the S-400 systems, and the first set of missile batteries is expected to begin deployment later this year. The United States imposed sanctions on Turkey for buying the same equipment last year. Cornyn and Warner, who are co-chairs of a Senate India caucus, said they shared the administration's concerns about Russia, but they warned of damage to cooperation with India if sanctions were to be imposed. "We believe that the application of CAATSA sanctions could have a deleterious effect on a strategic partnership with India, while at the same time not achieve the intended purpose of deterring Russian arms sales," they wrote. India has been cutting back on purchases of military equipment from Russia, which for years was its main source. With a 53% drop in Russian arms exports to India from 2016 to 2020 compared with the preceding 5-year period. India's defense deals with the United States, on the other hand, have been increasing, with sales at $3.4 billion in 2020 financial year. These are positive trends, the senators said. Imposing sanctions at this time could derail deepening cooperation with India across all aspects of our bilateral relationship, from vaccines to defense cooperation, from energy strategy to technology sharing. U.S. demand for oil surges, depleting tanks in Oklahoma. Crude oil tanks at the Cushing, Oklahoma storage hub are more depleted than they have been in the last 3 years, and prices of further dated oil contracts suggest they will stay lower for months. U.S. demand for crude among refiners making gasoline and diesel has surged as the economy has recovered from the worst of the pandemic. Demand across the globe means other countries have looked to the United States for crude barrels, also boosting draws out of Cushing. Analysts expect the draw on inventories to continue in the short term, which could further boost U.S. crude prices that have already climbed by about 25% in the last 2 months. The discount on U.S. crude futures to the international Brent benchmark should stay narrow. Storage at Cushing alone has the potential to really rally the market to the moon, said Bob Yager, director of energy futures at Mizuho. Cushing stockpiles have dropped to 31.2 million barrels, the lowest since October 2018, the Energy Information Administration said last week, or about half of where inventories were at this time a year ago. Inventories have fallen because of a ramp-up in U.S. demand, which has encouraged domestic refiners to keep crude at home to provide fuels such as gasoline and distillates to U.S. consumers, said Rita Anson, senior commodity analyst at Kepler. In addition, U.S. production has been slow to recover from declines seen in 2020. At the end of 2019, the nation was producing roughly 13 million barrels of oil per day, but in recent weeks has been less than 11.5 million BPD. At the same time, product supplied by refineries, a proxy for demand, is about just 1% below pre-pandemic peaks. As a result, the spread between U.S. crude and international benchmark Brent has collapsed. The spread between U.S. crude delivered to Cushing and Brent narrowed to roughly $1.09 a barrel this week from $4.47 earlier this month, which had been about the widest spread since May 2020. In an additional sign of high short-term demand for U.S. crude, the premium for U.S. crude delivered this December versus December 2022 reached a high this week of $12.48 per barrel, most since at least 2014, according to Refinitiv Icon data. In the next 3 months, Rystad Energy expects refinery runs in the United States to increase by 500,000 to 600,000 barrels per day. This would outpace production gains of 300,000-400,000 barrels per day and keep the WTI Brent spread narrow. Only if OPEC intervenes with more supply of crude or if COVID rears its ugly head again, curbing demand, this high volatility will come off, said Mukesh Sadhav, Senior Vice President and Head of Downstream at Rystad Energy. Influential U.S. comedian Mort Sahl dies at age 94. Mort Sahl, who strolled on stage with a newspaper and shook up the comedy world in the 1950s and 60 Seconds with a groundbreaking critical look at American life and politics, died on Tuesday at the age of 94, the New York Times and Washington Post reported. Sahl, who was widely considered the father of modern political satire, died at his home near San Francisco. The newspaper cited a friend as saying she did not give a cause of death. Reuters could not immediately independently confirm the death. Sahl was credited with influencing comedians such as George Carlin, Woody Allen, and Jonathan Winters. He was also a friend of another comedy mold breaker, Lenny Bruce, although his act did not include profanity as Bruce's did. His Mort Sahl at Sunset, released in 1955, was the first stand-up comedy album, and 3 years later, he had a Broadway show. Morton Lyon Sahl was born in Montreal on May 11, 1927, and grew up in Los Angeles. He graduated from the University of Southern California and moved to the San Francisco area in the early 1950s to try comedy. He lived in his car part of the time before building a following at San Francisco's legendary Hungry i nightclub and then going on the road. By 1960, Sahl had become so popular that Time magazine, which called him Will Rogers with Fangs, put him on its cover. The first time a comedian had ever been so honored. Sahl's stage presence was different from the standard of the 1950s. He dressed informally in V-neck sweaters and was more irreverent, more intellectual, more hip and less rehearsed than his coat and tie contemporaries spouting mother-in-law jokes. Sahl took the stage with a newspaper and only an outline of an act while perching on a stool and relying on improvisation and responding to his audience. He would read from the newspaper to launch his comic riffs on the day's events with a quick-fire delivery that earned him the nickname Rebel without a pause. He simply declared, onward, when he was ready to change topics. It wasn't that he did political comedy, as everyone keeps insisting. Allen was quoted as saying in the book Seriously Funny, The Rebel Comedians of the 1950s and 1960s. It was that he had genuine insights. He made the country receptive to a kind of comedy it wasn't used to hearing. He made the country listen to jokes that required them to think, said Allen, the filmmaker and comedian. As Sahl often told his audience, I don't tell jokes. I give little lectures. A disturber. Sahl described himself to the New York Times in 2004 as a populist, a Puritan, a dreamer, and a disturber. He would ask his audiences, is there any group I haven't offended yet? And he spared neither Republican nor Democrat. Kennedy is trying to buy the country and Nixon is trying to sell it, he said. He would later mock Republican President George H.W. Bush as wishy-washy by saying, God bless George Bush. Long may he waver, and later used the same line on Democrat Bill Clinton. He kept it up through the rise of Donald Trump. I was on stage last night and I gave a medical report about Donald Trump, he said in an interview with the Library of Congress. I said he was hospitalized for an attack of modesty. Before that, Sahl liked to blast Senator Joe McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee for their pursuit of communists. If you were the only person left on the planet, I would have to attack you, Sahl said. That's my job. Sahl was closely linked with President John F. Kennedy. At the request of Kennedy's father, Sahl had written jokes for him to use while campaigning in 1960. But he later made acerbic jokes about the Kennedy family. Club owners then refused to book Sahl because they had been threatened with tax audits, according to the book Revel with a Cause, Liberal Satire in Post-War America. Sahl became obsessed with Kennedy's 1963 assassination. His attacks on the Warren Commission report, which concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in killing the president, became a big part of his act, including readings from the report, turning off his audiences and damaging his career. He joined New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison in investigating assassination conspiracy theories and said he believed the same entity was responsible for the assassinations of Kennedy, his brother Robert, and civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. Sahl partially rebounded in the 1970s as non-traditional comedians such as Carlin and Richard Pryor broke through. In 1988, he had a one-man off-Broadway show titled Mort Sahl's America. Even in his 90 seconds, Sahl performed weekly at a theater near his Mill Valley, California, home, with the shows being live-streamed on the internet. He had been a close friend of Robin Williams, who lived nearby, before the comic actor's suicide in 2014.